we've got to talk about Sjogrens. If you think this is just dry eyes and dry mouth, I want you to pause for a second, because that belief didn't come from medicine. It came from a bumper sticker description that got repeated so many times that even doctors stopped looking past it. There are people alive right now who spent 10, 15, 30 years being told they were fine. Tired? That's just life. Dry eyes? Use some drops. Joint pain? You're probably just getting older. And then one day a blood test lands on a desk and the whole story changes, because it was never just dry eyes. It was their own immune system, quietly attacking their own body, the entire time. And I think the part almost everybody misses is that this isn't a story about some rare disease nobody's ever heard of. This is a story about a common disease that the system simply isn't built to catch. There's a distinction I want to make right here, because it applies to more than Sjogrens. There's a difference between a disease and the system that's supposed to find it. That gap, right there, is where millions of people are currently living. Undiagnosed. Not because the disease is rare. Because the system wasn't built to see it in time. Let me introduce you to someone. We'll call her Maren. She isn't one specific person, she's a composite, built out of the patterns that show up again and again in patient accounts and clinical research, but I want you to picture her as one woman, because that's how this disease actually happens, one person at a time. I built something specifically not for just tracking and doctor's appointment. It is called Sjogrens' Ultimate Symptom Map and Diagnostic Action Plan, and it walks you through exactly which symptoms to track not just for Sjogren but also for MS and I drop symptom map in the comment, and I would send the link for you to access it. Maren is 34. She used to run in the mornings before work. Somewhere around 31, the tired started. Not the normal kind. The kind where she'd sleep 9 hours and wake up feeling like she'd been hit by a truck. Her doctor ran a basic panel, everything came back normal, and she got sent home with a suggestion to manage her stress better. A year later, her eyes started feeling like there was sand under her lids every single afternoon. She started carrying eye drops in her purse like other people carry gum. Her optometrist noted mild dry eye and recommended a thicker drop. Nobody asked why a 32-year-old woman with no allergies suddenly had chronically dry eyes. Then her mouth started drying out so badly at night that she'd wake up at 2 in the morning needing water just to speak. Her dentist noticed she'd developed 2 cavities in her mouth that hadn't had a single cavity in over a decade, and mentioned she should floss more. By the time Maren finally sat in front of a rheumatologist, almost 4 years had passed since that first wave of exhaustion. 4 years of quietly wondering if she was just lazy, if she was just getting older, if this was just what her 30s were going to feel like. The blood work came back positive for the antibodies associated with Sjogren's within about a week of actually being ordered. The test that finally explained 4 years of her life took 15 minutes to run once somebody decided to run it. By the end of this, you're going to understand exactly where that gap opens up, why it's so hard to close, what it actually costs a person to fall into it, and the 3 paths a person's Sjogren's story can take once they're inside it. Let's start with the myth. The myth is that Sjogren's is a nuisance autoimmune disease. Dry eyes, dry mouth, a little uncomfortable, not exactly life-threatening, not exactly urgent. Here's the reality. Sjogren's is actually the second most common autoimmune rheumatic disease that exists. It's systemic, which means it doesn't stay quietly in your eyes and your mouth. It can move into your joints, your lungs, your nerves, your kidneys, your skin, your blood vessels. Around 9 out of every 10 patients are women, and it very often shows up right in the years when life is already loud. New careers. New kids. Aging parents who need caregiving. The years nobody has spare time to be sick in. And that detail matters, because it destroys a very convenient myth, the idea that if a disease were actually serious, doctors would catch it fast. They don't. Not because they don't care. Because Sjogren's is a master of disguise, and disguise is the whole reason this disease gets away with what it gets away with for so long. So let's talk about how the diagnosis actually gets taken from someone, because it isn't a dramatic collapse. It's an erosion. A slow interruption of a completely normal life, one dismissed symptom at a time. First, the fatigue arrives. Not the kind of tired where a coffee fixes you. Bone deep, doesn't improve with sleep, doesn't care how many hours you gave it, tired. And that gets waved off first, almost every single time, because fatigue is the most common complaint walking into any doctor's office on any given day, and it's the easiest one to attach to something else. stress, poor sleep, a busy season of life. Nobody runs a rheumatology panel because you're tired. Think about a second composite story here. We'll call him Desmond. Men make up a small minority of Sjogren's cases, which is exactly why his story took even longer to land. Desmond was 51, a contractor, physically active, the kind of guy who prided himself on not going to the doctor unless something was actually broken. The fatigue crept in first, and he chalked it up to age, to a physically demanding job, to just getting older. Then came the dry mouth, which he barely registered because he assumed it was dehydration from working outside all day. It was the joint pain in his hands that finally worried him, because a contractor with stiff, swollen hands is a contractor who can't work. He saw an orthopedist first, who found nothing structurally wrong and suggested it might be early arthritis. It took almost 6 years, and a chance conversation with a rheumatologist his sister happened to see for an unrelated issue, before anyone connected fatigue plus dry mouth plus joint pain into one single diagnosis instead of 3 separate, unrelated complaints. 6 years of a man quietly assuming his body was just wearing out, when the entire time it was something specific, something with a name, something treatable. Then the dryness shows up. Eyes that feel like sand every time you blink. A mouth so dry that talking for more than a few minutes becomes uncomfortable, that swallowing crackers or bread without water becomes genuinely difficult, that your sense of taste starts to change. And even this, the single most defining symptom of the disease, gets treated as its own separate, disconnected little problem. You get sent to buy artificial tears. You get told to drink more water. For patients whose dryness is the dominant symptom, it can take somewhere around 10 years just to go from a basic dry eye diagnosis to the actual underlying Sjogren's diagnosis sitting beneath it the whole time. Then the joint pain shows up, and this is usually where the story gets rewritten by somebody else entirely. Because the symptoms overlap so heavily with menopause, with seasonal allergies, with plain ordinary aging, they frequently just get folded into one of those explanations instead of getting investigated on their own. And once a story like that gets written into your medical chart, it is sticky. Every new symptom after that point tends to get read back through that old lens instead of getting a fresh look. A doctor sees possible early menopause in the notes from 2 years ago, and the dry mouth you're describing today quietly gets filed under the same heading, even though nobody re-examined the original assumption. This is how a diagnosis gets taken away from a person. Not through one bad doctor making one bad call. Through a slow accumulation of plausible, reasonable sounding, it's probably nothing serious moments, stacked one on top of another over years. And here's the part that compounds everything. Once dismissal becomes the pattern, patients learn a second lesson fast, and it's a lesson nobody teaches on purpose. They learn to stop mentioning things. Every visit where a real, physical symptom gets waved away teaches a person to bring less of themselves into the room the next time. Why describe the brain fog if the fatigue already got laughed off? Why bring up the joint stiffness if the dry mouth already got handed a bottle of mouthwash and a shrug? Silence becomes the coping mechanism. And once silence becomes the coping mechanism, the diagnosis gets even harder to reach, because now the doctor is working with half the picture, sometimes less than half, and has no way of knowing it. There's a version of this story that shows up constantly in patient communities, and I want to give it a name too, even though again, this is a composite drawn from a pattern rather than one single case. Call her Priya. Priya was told for 3 straight years that her symptoms were anxiety. Every visit, the fatigue and the dry mouth and the occasional joint ache got folded into a conversation about stress management and whether she wanted to try an antidepressant. She wasn't imagining her exhaustion, but she started to genuinely wonder if she was. That's one of the cruelest parts of this entire disease, the way dismissal doesn't just delay a diagnosis, it can make a person distrust their own body's signals. Priya finally got answers after a dentist, of all people, noticed an unusual pattern of dry mouth-related tooth decay during a routine cleaning and asked one extra question that nobody else had thought to ask. Was she also experiencing joint pain, fatigue, dry eyes? She was. That one question, from a dentist, not a doctor, is what finally opened the door to the diagnosis that had been sitting there the entire 3 years. If doubt about your own symptoms becomes routine, dismissal starts looking a whole lot like a diagnosis, even though it isn't one. Now let's put some real numbers on this, because this isn't a fringe condition happening to a handful of unlucky people. An estimated 4 million Americans currently have Sjogren's. Of those 4 million, Roughly 2.5 million don't know it yet. Some estimates put the undiagnosed share as high as half of all cases that exist. Half. Think about that for a second. If you lined up every person currently living with this disease, roughly every other one of them has no idea it's happening inside their own body right now. Somewhere out there right now, there's a version of Marin, a version of Desmond, a version of Priya, sitting in a waiting room, being told their blood work looks normal, wondering why they still feel like this. And here's the part that raises the stakes past simple discomfort. This isn't purely a quality of life issue, even though quality of life absolutely takes a hit. Sjogren's patients carry roughly a 16 times higher risk of developing lymphoma compared to someone without the disease. 16 times. That single number is the reason early diagnosis actually matters in a very concrete, very physical way, not just an emotional or validating way. Catching it early means real, tangible outcomes. Better symptom control. Closer monitoring for the complications that matter most. A genuine shot at catching something dangerous before it becomes permanent instead of after. To be fair to the system, this gap did get noticed. Back in 2012, the average time from first symptoms to an actual diagnosis was sitting at nearly 6 years. A dedicated patient foundation set out to cut that number in half within 5 years, an ambitious goal at the time. And by 2018, they had actually pulled the average down to 2.8 years. That is real, measurable, documented progress, and it's worth acknowledging, because it proves something important. The delay was never some unavoidable fact of nature. It was a systems problem. And systems problems can be fixed once enough people decide they're actually worth fixing. But better is not the same thing as solved. Multiple years is still the norm, not the rare exception. And every single one of those years is a year of untreated inflammation running quietly in the background. A year of it's probably nothing. A year of a person quietly wondering, somewhere in the back of their mind, if they're the actual problem. If they're imagining it. If they're just being dramatic about being tired. Let's talk about why this disease is so good at disguising itself, because understanding the mechanism actually explains everything else. Sjogren's symptoms overlap with an enormous list of far more commonly diagnosed conditions. Depression and anxiety, because chronic fatigue and brain fog mimic mood disorders convincingly. Fibromyalgia, because widespread pain and fatigue look nearly identical on the surface. Chronic fatigue syndrome, for obvious reasons. Menopause, because dryness and fatigue are extremely common perimenopausal complaints. Plain aging, because joint stiffness and dryness both quietly increase as people get older anyway, disease or no disease. And because Sjogren's frequently shows up alongside other autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, sometimes it gets folded entirely into whichever of those diagnoses came first, treated as a footnote instead of its own separate, systemic condition that needs its own separate monitoring. Add to that the fact that no single doctor sees the whole picture. Your eye doctor sees dry eyes. Your dentist sees dry mouth and unusual cavity patterns. Your primary care doctor sees fatigue and joint pain. Your dermatologist might see a dry, sensitive skin issue or a rash. Individually, none of these specialists has a reason to connect their piece of the puzzle to anyone else's piece. It takes someone, at some point, actually stepping back and asking whether all of these seemingly unrelated complaints could be coming from one single source. And that step, that moment of connecting the dots, is exactly the step that so often takes years to happen. Marin, the woman from the beginning of this, described that moment to a patient support group once she was finally diagnosed, and it's a moment that shows up again and again in patient accounts. The relief of finally having a name for what had been happening to her, mixed with a strange, heavy grief for the 4 years she'd spent doubting herself. Both feelings at once. Relief and grief, arriving in the same appointment. When someone finally suspects Sjogren's, the actual diagnostic process is fairly specific. There's a simple eye test called a Schirmer test that measures how much moisture the eyes are actually producing. There's blood work looking for specific antibodies, most importantly ones called anti-Rho and anti-La, sometimes labeled SSA and SSB, along with more general markers like ANA and rheumatoid factor. There's sometimes a small lip biopsy, examining the tiny salivary glands just under the surface of the inner lip, looking for the specific inflammatory pattern that confirms the disease. And there are now formal diagnostic criteria that combine all of these pieces together into a single, structured checklist, so that a diagnosis isn't just a gut feeling, it's backed by an actual internationally agreed upon standard. The tools to diagnose this disease properly already exist. They are not experimental, they are not cutting edge, they are not expensive or hard to access in most cases. The bottleneck was never the test. The bottleneck was ever getting to the point where somebody actually orders it. Now let's talk about the three parts, because once a person is sitting inside that diagnostic gap, symptomatic but unheard, there are really only three ways this story tends to go. Path 1 is the loop. Nothing changes. Symptoms get treated individually, piece by piece, forever, without anyone ever connecting them into a single diagnosis. Eye drops for the eyes. Painkillers for the joints. Maybe an antidepressant for the fatigue and brain fog, because that's the explanation that got written down first. The person adapts. They learn to live smaller, to plan their days around their energy, to quietly manage a disease they don't even know they have. And the whole time, the actual underlying disease keeps running in the background, completely unmonitored. This path can last for years, sometimes decades. It doesn't get safer with time. It gets riskier, quietly, invisibly, the entire time nobody's watching for it. This is the path a lot of undiagnosed patients are living on right now, this exact moment, without knowing it. Path 2 is the partial catch. One symptom finally triggers the right test at the right moment. Sometimes it's the dry eyes finally getting referred to an actual eye specialist instead of just another bottle of drops. Sometimes it's a random blood work panel ordered for something completely unrelated that happens to flag an antibody nobody was even looking for. A doctor, somewhere, finally connects that one flagged result to the bigger picture, and the diagnosis lands. It's often late. Some damage may already exist by that point, whether that's dental damage from years of dry mouth, or eye damage from years of dry eyes, or joint damage that's already progressed further than it needed to. But management finally starts. This is, honestly, the most common way this story actually resolves for real people. This is Marin's path, and Desmond's path, and the path of the vast majority of people who eventually do get diagnosed. Path 3 is the early catch, and it's the rarest, and it's the one worth actually working toward. Someone, a dentist noticing an unusual pattern of cavities, an eye doctor noticing dryness that doesn't match the patient's age or lifestyle, a rheumatologist who happens to ask one extra question, or the patient themselves, having heard something like this and recognizing their own story in it, refuses to accept the simple explanation and asks the direct question. Could this actually be Sjogrens? This is Priya's path, in the end, even though it still took 3 years to get there. That's the path where fewer years get lost. Where monitoring starts before complications do instead of after. Where the disease gets managed on purpose instead of endured by accident. None of these three paths are decided by luck. They are decided entirely by whether someone, patient or provider, refuses to let its probably nothing be the final answer to a question that hasn't actually been properly investigated. Once a diagnosis does land, the actual management of Sjogrens is very real and very learnable. There are prescription options that stimulate natural saliva and tear production. There are artificial tears and saliva substitutes designed specifically for chronic dryness rather than occasional irritation. For patients with more systemic, whole-body involvement, there are medications originally developed for other autoimmune conditions, like hydroxychloroquine, that can help manage the broader disease activity. Dental care becomes a much bigger priority than it would be for most people, because chronic dry mouth dramatically increases the risk of cavities and gum disease, so more frequent checkups and specific fluoride treatments often become part of routine care. Simple environmental changes matter too, things like humidifiers at home, avoiding excessive caffeine and alcohol which both worsen dryness, and staying deliberately, consistently hydrated throughout the day rather than only when thirsty. None of this is complicated once it's actually identified. That's honestly one of the most frustrating parts of the entire story. The disease isn't mysterious once it's found. It's mysterious right up until the exact moment somebody finally looks for it properly, and then it becomes remarkably manageable almost overnight. Marin is on treatment now. She still gets tired faster than she used to, that part doesn't fully go away, but she has a name for it, a specialist tracking it, and a plan for the parts of her body Sjogrens puts at higher risk. She still remembers the exact moment she got the diagnosis more clearly than she remembers most of the 4 years before it. She said the strangest part wasn't the diagnosis itself, it was realizing how many small moments over those 4 years, doctors telling her she was fine, friends telling her she just needed more sleep, her own inner voice telling her to stop complaining, had all quietly been wrong at the same time. There's also a broader pattern worth naming here, because it's bigger than just this one disease. Historically, autoimmune conditions that disproportionately affect women have a documented track record of being written off as psychological, as stress, as anxiety, as simply being dramatic about ordinary symptoms, long before they get taken seriously as physical, measurable, testable disease. Sjogrens fits directly into that broader pattern. 9 out of 10 patients are women, and the symptoms, fatigue, pain, brain fog, are exactly the kind of complaints that have historically been the easiest for a system to wave away as emotional rather than physical. Recognizing that pattern doesn't fix it by itself. But it does explain a huge part of why the diagnostic gap exists in the first place, and why closing it has taken as long as it has. So here's the real takeaway, and it isn't really about Sjogrens specifically at all. It's about what happens when a person's own reported experience keeps getting quietly overridden by somebody else's simpler, more convenient explanation. Menopause. Stress. Aging. You're fine. Sjogrens isn't rare. It isn't exotic. It isn't hiding in some obscure corner of medicine that nobody's ever heard of. It's just quiet, and it's patient, and it counts on being dismissed one visit at a time, for years, until it finally can't be ignored anymore. The moment someone stops accepting the simple, convenient explanation and starts asking the next question instead, that's the exact moment the whole story changes. That's true for Maren. It's true for Desmond. It's true for Priya. And it's true for the patient sitting in the exam room right now, and for the doctor sitting across from them, deciding whether to ask one more question before writing the same explanation down again. If anything in this sounded familiar to you, your own fatigue, your own dryness, your own joint pain that's been quietly written off for years, that's genuinely worth bringing up directly with your doctor. Not because it means anything for certain on its own. Just because the question itself costs nothing to ask, and the delay is the one part of this entire story that's actually optional. See you in the next one.